There are some major maneuvers happening in Russia's Kursk region at the moment. Now, usually when we see something like this, it is one side rolling the dice. Here, however, both Ukraine and Russia are up to something. Call it the Great Kursk Dance of 2024. Thus, we find ourselves looking at the highest leverage situation in the region since the Kursk offensive began. Given that, I think it is worth trying to understand what exactly is happening. So, let's take a look at the news. As a starting point, we need to situate ourselves in Kursk. Consequently, if you have been following the war closely prior to the ongoing Russian counterattack, then you can safely skip ahead to the next chapter. Anyway, with all the focus on the war on the Eastern Front, Kyiv decided to pivot up here to Kursk Oblast. When Ukraine first broke through the lightly guarded border region back at the beginning of August, the blue and yellow soldiers were careful. They deliberately avoided sprinting as far north as possible. Doing so would have risked creating vulnerable supply lines, and would have also mandated a larger force to man the twisted, and therefore longer, front line. Rather, the troops radiated outward to take advantage of the initial breach. The most consequential gain came in the northwest of the salient. The same river runs from the north in Russia, cuts west, and then eventually forms part of the international border. Well, Ukraine pushed all the way against it. To make matters worse for Russia, only 3 bridges serve the area, and Ukraine promptly destroyed each of them, apparently a mix of fire from HIMARS and other systems. That left a pocket of Russian soldiers, effectively encircled by the river, pre-existing entrenchments, and Ukraine's ongoing offensive. Now, there were 3 things that Russia could do in this situation. Option 1 was to remember that discretion is the better part of valor, and retreat across the river. Heck, maybe even swim across if necessary. Option 2 was to try to build pontoon bridges to keep the area supplied and defendable. Essentially, do as much as possible to overlook the underlying problem. Option 3 was to try to dislodge Ukraine from the riverbank, thereby ending the encirclement the hard way. Okay, that is where we left things the last time that we discussed the situation. Since then, the intrigue has increased exponentially, as Russia had to make a decision about which option to pursue. The first option of retreat would have meant conceding a large quantity of land to Ukraine, right after Ukraine already took another large quantity of land. Moreover, precisely because of the river, trying to reclaim the lost land would have only become more challenging in the long run. Now, Russia is not above retreating when the situation calls for it. See Kherson in November 2022. But it is the strategy of last resort, and in the Kherson case, required the desperate pleading from the commander of forces, Sergei Surovikin. Instead, the second option of pontoon bridges became the preferred game plan for the Kremlin. However, the tricky thing about pontoon bridges is that they take time to set up, and leave you as a sitting duck for long-range artillery. What we are seeing now with the advent of drones everywhere is that trying to do anything secretly in such a small amount of space is next to impossible. Here, this is only about 12 and 25 kilometers. Tiny stuff. So Russia tried to build pontoons, but Ukraine has consistently found them and destroyed them. Presumably, Russia is continuing that effort, but eventually the Kremlin is going to run into limits with a finite amount of equipment that Ukraine is also targeting. Thus, Option 1 was on pause, and Option 2 was not working. That left Option 3, the most dangerous of the bunch. Whispers of a Russian counterattack in the area began last week, and there seemed to be concerns in the West that Russia was making significant progress, as though Moscow had gotten serious about the situation and started redeploying its better forces from the Eastern Front. Now, that part remains to be seen, but focusing on the Kursk region, we can start to understand what Russia's plan was, and how Ukraine may have been prepared to counter the counterattack. Russia's clear target was here, along the river that Ukraine had cut off. The reason is that it granted Russia an opportunity to flank Ukraine by sending some of its trapped soldiers northeast, and to have another group descend southward to lock both sides. And indeed, it appears that this strategy was effective. Russia reopened a corridor along the river. Now, that would not have been the end of the Kursk offensive, but it still would have been a major disappointment for Ukraine. The Western Kursk encirclement was the best opportunity that Ukraine will have for a while to take substantial territory and generate international headlines. But with Russia reopening a supply corridor, it seemed like such an opportunity was off the table. Except that Ukraine may have been prepared to counter this exact strategy. Following Russia's commitment to the attack, Ukraine promptly took two countermeasures. First was to launch an attack of its own on the area vacated by the trapped Russian soldiers. The obvious effect was to replace land lost over here with land gained down here. But it also imposed two strategic problems on Russia. Toward the west, it gives Ukraine two sub-options. One, pushing to the river would further confine whatever Russian soldiers remain in the pocket. The trade-off for Ukraine is that extending the salient to the river risks opening up a flanking opportunity for Russia, though I suspect that Ukraine is not very concerned by the military state of the cut-off soldiers, given their period of isolation. But if Russia lacks the ability to flank Ukraine here, toward the east, Ukraine's movement also prevents Russian troops from having an easy place to fall back to, which would be a serious problem if the river gets cut off once again. Resetting things to the current situation, the second sub-option is lower risk. Ukraine could simply cut straight east. This would make a play on a smaller area, but create a very precarious position for Russia there. Once cut across, it would be difficult for Russian soldiers to do much but surrender, leading to a map that would look like this, and giving Ukraine a large increase to its pool of prisoners to swap. This was already a major benefit of the Kursk offensive, with the images that you are seeing here a part of a September 14th exchange of 103 POWs. Besides, Ukraine could then move back to the river afterward, and still put pressure on the Western encirclement as intended. In any case, the creation of this new salient was a straightforward reply for Ukraine. Russia lowered its defenses there, and Ukraine simply took advantage to offset the problems elsewhere. Basic stuff. However, Ukraine's second broad countermeasure was the more strategically adventurous gambit. Remember, Russia was sending forces to open up the river corridor here. The obvious response in that area would be to push right back and aim to cut off Russia for a second time. But that is not what Ukraine chose to do. Rather, its soldiers turned their sights north, extending the salient out to here. To repeat, faced with a counterattack, Ukraine chose to further extend itself. Now, the risk here is apparent. If Russia pushes further east, then these guys could quickly find themselves encircled if more Russians appear in the north. And indeed, by intention or coincidence, Russia tried an assault toward the center of Ukraine's gains. Ironically, however, they found themselves encircled as Ukraine sealed the advance right behind Russia. However, and this is key, encirclement does not mean defeat. Russia is outpacing Ukraine's movements at the moment, and it is possible for Russia to pinch Ukraine right back using the encircled forces. But what will happen there is a headache to be answered another day. There is certainly more to this story, but that is where things stand at the time of production. Russia still has access to its river corridor, and Ukraine has not fully bisected the sieged area. It is worth remembering that about a month passed between the last major development in Kursk and the current maneuvers, so observers may need to be patient here. But for now, let's pivot to why Ukraine is trying this in the first place. And the answer remains the river. The further that Ukraine can spread out up north, the longer Russia's supply lines are into the former Kursk pocket. That will keep whoever remains inside on edge, and risk a situation where Ukraine can once again push up against the river, and potentially now trap more Russian soldiers and supplies inside. You see, normally encircling the enemy is difficult because you have to go all the way around. But when a river forms a wall for you, the game plan is simple. Just go forward. And thus we find ourselves in a high leverage situation in the war, where Russia has committed more resources to saving the encircled personnel within Kursk, the bulk of whom are likely conscripts, and therefore political liabilities for Moscow. That effort may yet prove successful, but it has also added more to Ukraine's jackpot. Meanwhile, if you are looking for a good read, you will hit your own personal jackpot with these 2 books on the war. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.